talking about how to construct a morality or how to live within a moral system. And you've suggested, I think rightly, that the effect of reason on religious principle as inherited over time has purified many of those principles, made those principles better, made for a better world. I totally agree with that, obviously. I believe that the way that I've put it with regard to civilization myself is that civilization is a suspension bridge, basically, between a pole that is certain fundamental assumed premises that can't be proved by science, and then science and reason. And the fact is that where I start to get a little afraid is if the pull of science and reason begins to believe that it is self-perpetuating and we lose some of the fundamental principles. So the example that I would give is you mentioned Darwinism before. It is perfectly plausible and, in fact, fairly easy to read social Darwinism into Darwinism, and people did for several generations. And so now we say,
at least 2 generations.
Exactly. And so now we say, okay, that never should have happened, obviously. That's wrong. That's a bad read of Darwinism. There's no reason you have to read evolution to suggest that we should benefit certain people at the expense of other people. But that is a moral reading of Darwin, not a reading of Darwin that is inherent in Darwin itself. Meaning that is bringing premises that actually pre-exist Darwin to bear on that, if properly read.
It's bringing bias.
Right.
Which humans are highly susceptible to, and especially in the social sciences. So there's less bias in the sciences that don't involve human behavior. You can still have bias, there's just less of it. And the consequences are less dire if anything that happens becomes policy. And so that's the digested analysis of what came out of Darwinism. But
so I think the reason that this comes up is there was one tweet that you sent, and of course I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. There's this one tweet that you sent that drew an enormous amount of ire on particularly the right about rationalia, that you were looking forward to the...
I remember rationalia.
So first of all, what would rationalia... So this is for those who missed the tweet, the suggestion was
this like 3 years ago now.
It was a fascinating conversation because it began this whole kind of discussion about what a well-governed system would look like or who would govern that system. And so I don't want to miss what exactly you were saying there.
Sure.
So why don't you suggest it so I don't misquote you?
To clarify, I was at a conference in the Canary Islands, and there was a conversation I walked into during the cocktail hour, and there was already buzz. It involved a woman whose name I forgot, but I mentioned her name in my Facebook note that expands on the rationalia tweet. And she had the idea of having a place called Rational Land, okay? And I said, no, we need a better name than Rational Land. So Rationalia, right? You have Somalia, Serbia, Rationalia. And the premise in this room of people, this is a conference of scientists and artists, actually, was that imagine a community. It could be virtual, doesn't have to have geographic boundaries, where all laws are created only on the strength of evidence in support of them. Period. All laws. Now, if you think about that, that has very sound principles, because especially in America, especially in America, we've got a diversity of cultures, religions, other kinds of belief systems. And we're technically supposed to celebrate that. E pluribus unum, right? Many is one, or one is many, right? Out of many, one. Thank you. And so you were polite to let me figure it out. He's going to get it? He's going to get it? Okay, I'll help him out. Very polite of you. So in such a place, if I had some belief system based on my religion or culture or whatever, and I rise to political power and I want to make a law, the laws apply to everyone in the land. But if that law derives from my belief system, and now I force others into that law, that's a recipe for disaster. That is how to guarantee an unstable culture, or unstable civilization. It destabilizes civilization. So the idea is, any law that applies to everybody needs to be based on some objective truths. And how do you establish objective truths? The best way we know is by the methods and tools of science. And the strength of the law would be commensurate with the strength of the evidence to support it. And if you don't have the evidence to support it, you have no business making a law for it. So that would be the premise. And then some people jumped in the. I don't read every one. You probably don't either, because you.
No. No.
Talk about pissing off the internet. You're king of pissing off the internet. Try to drag me into this.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome to my lair.
Right. So how would this work? So a lot of the debates centered on, well, who's going to decide what's true enough to base a law on it? And other people didn't see my actual words. There's a lot of reading comprehension issues I've noticed. I said objective truth, and people read that as absolute truth. Mm-hmm. And that's not the word I used. And people said, who's to decide what is absolute truth? And there's no such thing as an absolute truth. And I never said that.
Right.
And there's a difference. I'm not convinced there's an absolute truth. Science establishes what is true based on evidence, and that seems to work. But there could be later evidence that gets to a deeper truth, and we're open to that. That's how we went from Newton to Einstein.
Right.
Newton still works. You took physics for sure. Mm-hmm. You still use Newton's equations, but there are situations where they don't apply. They break down, and you need a bigger story. So in comes Einstein, draws a bigger circle around the Newtonian physics, and so now Einstein has a deeper understanding of the universe, but it doesn't negate Newton in the regime in which it had previously applied. It still applies. And I was going to jump in and continue, but it got very. Well,
you have a life to live. I mean, that's.
I got a wife. I got kids.
Exactly.
I want to eat. I want to. So, but I'm glad it introduced some kind of thinking about what kinds of forces should operate on laws that we all must obey.
So I think that there were two well-founded criticisms. There were a lot of poorly founded criticisms. I think there were two well-founded critiques, I should say.
By the way, there are letters in this book that are asking about morality.
Right.
They come from a religious, they don't make a big deal of what religion they're from. Generally, they're Christian, but they want to have a sort of secular conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And the book is great, by the way.
Yeah,
Everyone should get it.
And they come to it from a religious background, but they just want to find out where science comes from. And I want to hear the rest of your question, but I just want to say that these letters, these are people who want to have the conversation.
Yeah.
There are plenty who just don't. And I never see those letters.
And listen, as a religious person who is constantly discussing issues in the public eye, I won't cite the Bible as proof of positions. I don't think that is a valuable source in terms of being able to discuss with people. It's an appeal to authority that a huge number of people don't accept. I mean, it's no better than just citing any other random person on the street for a lot of folks. Right. So what difference does that make? But I think that when it came to the Rationalia tweet, there were two critiques that I saw that I thought were interesting.
Tell me, yeah.
So one was that the question isn't, should we bring the best data to bear when making a law? Like, everybody who has any shred of rationality should, of course, want the best data to be brought to bear. The question when we make a law is one of competing values, meaning you're assuming that everybody has the same ends in mind, and that isn't always the case. So to take an obvious example, let's say that there were evidence that removing all guns in the United States would lower violent crime in the United States. So do you remove all guns from people in the United States? That is actually a question of values, not purely a question of whether a law would be effective in achieving a particular end, because the end itself is one of the questions. Do you want a society where no one has the capacity to protect themselves against a tyrannical government, for example?
Right. So I would say that as posed, that makes complete sense. But that's not how I would have posed it. The way you pose it is there something you want as a society to turn into law? What would that be? Okay? And then you would test to see whether that will fulfill your objectives. If it will fulfill your objectives, then you put it into law. That's how you do this. You don't say, I want to get rid of all guns, let's make it a law. No, you ask collectively, in a democracy, the republic in which we live, you ask, what are your goals? Is your goal to have fewer people die from guns? Is that the goal? How would we accomplish this goal? And then you do the research and you find out, oh, you can have biometric handles. It reads my handprint. So my gun is my gun. You steal my gun, you can't use it. That solves that problem, okay? Unless you don't want that problem solved. You have the right to do that as a citizen in a democracy. You say, I don't want that. I don't think that's a problem. Let's not bring that to a law. That's the only point here. The law is to capture, to either support or deny something you want to put into effect as a law.
Okay,
that's
then
we're
in agreement,
Yeah,
obviously.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
So the other question that I saw was the sort of application of this principle. So this has been used over the course of the 20th century, particularly to move the system of American government away from a legislative-led system of government toward a bureaucratic system of government, where an enormous amount of regulation and rulemaking is made by executive agencies, purportedly by experts. And one of the problems there is that a lot of these places become subject to regulatory capture. There's an evolution.
What is regulatory capture?
Regulatory capture means that you have lobbying groups, for example, that get a hold of the EPA and now are making it, and now the bureaucrats who are largely unassailable by the legislature and the executive doesn't pay attention to them.
So that sounds like it is things happening in the world that affect us all that are not derived from objectively researched
Right. So I'm asking about the implementation of your principle on an actual particular level. Meaning, were you just talking in a utopian world, or is there a way to apply any of this sort of stuff?
That's a great question then. Yeah, I didn't know where you were going to land on that. Right? Mm-hmm. So we have agencies that are entirely tasked with finding out what is objectively true. Leading among them, and by the way, a lot of the cross tweets were saying, yeah, this is the Department of Truth, or whatever, in George Orwell,
right,
or the
1984.
1984, or in Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. Didn't they actually have a Bureau of Propaganda? Literally called
led by
that?
Goebbels, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think they even called it the So the National Academy of Sciences, which was signed into law, created under the leadership of America's first Republican president, who you know that is. Who is that?
America's first Republican president was Lincoln.
Lincoln, exactly. 1863, when he clearly had other things he needed to worry about in 1863. There he signed the National Academy of Sciences because Europe was riding high economically, scientifically, from an engineering point of view. They were fully exploiting the fruits of the Industrial Revolution, and they were kind of slowly working their way across the pond back here to the United States. He said, we have to get into that. So the National Academy of Sciences has one job, and that is to report on what is objectively true in the scientific fields in ways that can inform policy at the executive branch and in the legislative branch. That's their job. So when they come out with a report, they have reviewed all the evidence, and if they can't arrive at a conclusion, they'll tell you that. The evidence is inconclusive. Evidence is conclusive. This is where now you can do whatever you want with your policy because it's not rationalia. Mm-hmm. You still have lawmakers who are responsive to a constituency, to lobbyists and the like. But don't tell me you don't have the evidence there to base it on. And so you would enhance the importance and significance of a National Academy of Sciences so that you wouldn't have small groups with non-representative belief systems taking over the whole country's conduct.
So let's talk about the scientific process as it's currently carried out in the United States. One of the things that I'm afraid of, and I see it from the right on certain issues and from the left on certain issues, is a fear of actually investigating certain areas of science. So on the right, obviously, people typically cite climate change here and say, well, the right refuses to acknowledge that climate change is even happening, or at least so large swaths of the right refuse to acknowledge that climate change is even happening. And
or anthropically
generated climate change. Yeah. So most radicals will say it's not even happening at all, that this is just part of a general warming trend, or that it has stopped, or any of that. But why don't we start with that, and then we'll get to sort of areas on the left where science has been politicized, or where maybe inquiry has been limited. Or attempted to be limited. So on the climate change issue,
or hijacked.
Yeah. So let's talk about the climate change issue for a second. So what do we know and what is uncertain? Because this seems to be There are, it seems to me, gray areas, but the gray areas are baked into the science, meaning that according to the IPCC report, the climate could warm anywhere from 2 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius over the course of the next century or so. We're still not sure exactly of the level of climate sensitivity to human activity. You can acknowledge that human activity is responsible for the majority to the vast majority of climate change that has happened on Earth for the past century or so.
Yeah, industrial age. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But what is the range of outcomes? And does that suggest that if you have a different point of view on the solutions, that this amounts to climate denial? That's the part that I start to get dicey about.
Yeah, so I mean, professionally, I'm an astrophysicist, not a climate scientist,
right.
But I do read. And
right, and you've talked about this
and
before.
I do recognize when a scientific consensus emerges, and I want to make it clear what I mean by the word consensus. A scientific consensus is one, it's not where everyone gets in a room and says, hey, let's vote. No, that's not how truth is established. It's established by looking at peer-reviewed research and asking, in what direction is that taking us? What is it saying? And not any one research paper has all answers in it. They're like pieces of answers. And I looked at this ice core in this section of Greenland. Well, I looked at an ice core in Antarctica going back 100,000 years. Well, I looked at the migration patterns of this insect. And you start piecing together the biology, the chemistry, the geology, the atmospheric science, and it's all pointing in the same direction. When that happens, it's time to sit up and take notice. What the hell is going on? Okay? And when we speak of a climate consensus, what we're saying is that the overwhelming majority of the scientific community has produced research evidence citing that humans are responsible for climate changing in this world, leading to the warming of temperatures in the atmosphere. Period. If you want to deny that, you are denying it because it conflicts with your cultural or political principles. Okay, it's a free country. Go ahead and do so. But if you now rise to power over legislation, that's dangerous. It's irresponsible and dangerous. So the challenges are modeling climate. Oh my gosh. It's like there's the heating of the oceans from the sun, and then the oceans keep some of the heat, and they trap it and put it low. So then when the atmosphere cools, the ocean releases some of that heat back, and then the trees and the ice caps reflect sunlight back. But if they shrink, then there's more. So there's
a lot of
there's 100 stuff. So that's why there's variance in the predictions that come from it. But the predictions all point in the same general direction. You will never have 100% of all scientists agreeing. That's not how progress in science works. What you're looking for is the overwhelming. If only half the scientific papers showed this and the other half didn't, you got no result.
I guess the question that I have about climate change, and at least its public-facing sort of presentation, is the level of uncertainty when it comes to its effects. So you can acknowledge that climate change is happening. There are people who talk about catastrophic climate change, millions of migrants suddenly running around the world, Miami underwater.
Yeah.
We're all dead within a century and a half. So a certain catastrophic
that won't happen.
Level.
We will not all be dead in a century and a half.
No, and
we'll just flood all our coastlines.
Well, and by flooding all our coastlines, it's not going to be immediate. You mean that there will be a gradual increase in sea level,
however,
which can be mitigated in certain ways, presumably.
However, consider that most of the world's most important cities are on the water's edge, historically for transportation, for commerce, and the like. The most important cities in the world are on the water. Okay. Most of the most important cities in the world are found in that way. All right. So it's not like the water level starts to rise. You might, if you're following my tweets, I said if we lose the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, then all that water goes back into the ocean levels will rise. It'll rise to the level of the Statue of Liberty's left elbow.
Yeah, what are the chances that the entire Greenland ice sheet or the entire Antarctic ice sheet would melt?
It's a limiting case. It's the limiting case.
Well, if an asteroid were to hit the Earth, we'd all be dead. But
yes, no, but it's if you want to ask how bad could it get, that's how bad could get. And just to,
Is it,
just to get her elbows straight, she's holding the Declaration of Independence in her left. It's that elbow, not this elbow.
Not the one.
Okay.
So if you're between them, you're
fine.
good. But I guess
so
I mean, but this is one of the areas where I feel like, okay, so why are we talking about the limiting case as opposed to most likely case, or the cases that are most likely to fall within the range of possibility? And is that sort of alarmism generative of bad thinking about possible solutions? Meaning that
during the dinosaurs, during periods of when the dinosaurs roamed, there was no ice on Earth. And so there was much less land. When you enter an ice age, water evaporates from the oceans. It goes up to clouds. The clouds move over land. It snows. But it's so cold, the snow never melts. It just stays there. And this just keeps happening. So you're systematically draining the ocean. And you're building snow layers on the ground, on land masses. These are glaciers. Glaciers are slow moving, and they're very, they'll slowly go back to the ocean, but slower than the rate at which the oceans are being drained. That's what revealed the Bering Strait land bridge to our nomadic ancestors. Said, hey, let's keep walking. They just keep walking. It's just land. Let's keep walking. And they walk into North America. The ice age ends. It melts. The water levels rise. The land bridge is broken. And never the twain would meet for tens of thousands of years, stranding an entire branch of the human species in North and South America. By the way, which is why the Columbus voyage was, in my read of history, the single most important thing that ever happened in civilization. Now, if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else, but it happened to be him. He reconnected these two separate branches of the human species that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. That's a profound fact for me. So it's already been the case that the Earth had no ice, had a lot of ice.
Right.
So this is not like, we've already been hit by an asteroid. So
right.
You could say, oh, asteroid, that's right. Tell that to the dinosaurs, right? The dead dinosaurs who didn't have a space program or opposable thumbs. They need both. So the issue is not that the water level will rise and you can just walk away from it. It rises this much, and the next storm surge, combined with a high tide, which you almost always get with a hurricane, because it takes a long time for a hurricane to move up the coast. It takes typically a couple of weeks. Somewhere in there's going to be full moon or new moon high tide with a storm surge. Suppose your jetties or levees or whatever it is that keeps your city safe from the water that's out right there in the river or in the bay or in the ocean. Whatever that height is what you decided would be what would protect the city.
Right.
The ocean goes up an inch. That's all it takes. 1 inch to breach your levees. If you breach it by 1 inch, your city is now connected to a semi-infinite amount of water for as long as that hurricane is sitting there. And the water just pours in. That's what happened here in Hurricane Sandy.
Katrina also breached all the levees.
Yeah, well,
the levees broke there.
Well, levees broke. Don't get me started. That was like an engineering. I mean, Katrina was Category 3. It already passed through New Orleans. People were like sweeping up the branches. Okay, we survived that. Then the levees broke. Okay, so the broken levees flooded New Orleans, not Katrina. We keep blaming Katrina without putting the lens back on our own maintenance of our infrastructure and our anticipation of what could happen given certain forces of nature. My point is, you're going to flood your city not because the water will slowly rise. You're going to flood your city because the storm that has the benefit of that extra inch, plus a storm surge, plus a higher intensity of the storm, because if the atmosphere is warmer, it carries more moisture. There's more heat driving the intensity of storms. You'll breach that, you'll flood the city. And there you have it. Or you lose your beach house. It happens in those storms. That's your first indication that your coastline is at risk. And not to mention those countries, island countries in the South Pacific, where the average elevation is a few feet above sea level. So you talked about refugees. You know who knows about global warming and who's preparing for it? Insurance companies and the military. The military cares. Our military cares about where there is unrest in the world. Where if people are displaced, that creates problems because they got to go somewhere, and the borders are closed. Well, unless you're near a nice country, right? So yeah, it affects more than just your beach house.
No, for sure. I mean, the question becomes whether mitigation is the chief method of fighting this, or adaptation is the chief method of fighting this, or geoengineering. Should we be building more levies?
I
building
love
levees higher?
geoengineering.
I mean, I'm a fan. I like technology. Technology is helpful.
It's in its infancy, geoengineering. But for me, one pie in the sky thought I have is a hurricane's coming and ready to destroy a city. You put in some big anemometer inside the hurricane, right? And it spins the anemometer. But the anemometer is itself a turbine, right? So it's sucking energy from the cyclonic motion of the hurricane, and you use that to drive the energy needs of the city that it might otherwise destroy.
You should propose that to President Trump. I mean, he's going to nuke a hurricane. This sounds better than that. So that's it. So moving on from climate change, which is an area, as I said, where some people on the right are not particularly interested, to areas